Welcome to How to Become a Production SQL Database Administrator. My name is Raphael. We have finally come to the stage of understanding what a transactional log file is and its role, and a database file and its role. And now we're going to create a database with all that understanding of the previous videos. So there are two primary ways to create a database. One is through a GUI and one is through scripting it out, and I'm going to show you both. So as you can see on the left-hand side in the Object Explorer, you've got the databases here. And if you want to create a database using a GUI, then that's a very simple process. Go to Database folder, right-click, and go New Database. In here, you will have the interface that allows us to create a database. So let's call this Database Production. Production. And now you can see that as you create the name, the database files are automatically created. And as we've mentioned, there are two primary files, the data files and the transactional log files. But note that, as we've mentioned repeatedly, if I were to go OK here, then the database will be created based on what the model database was and its configuration, which is as following. But we don't want that, and you certainly don't want that in a production environment. So we physically have to change the size of the data files, we have to change the physical size of the transactional log file, and then we have to change the auto growth pattern here. And this is where you can do it in a GUI. So let's say we wanted an initial size of the database to be 1000 megabytes or 1 gig. So we can change it here. And let's say we want the initial sizing of the transaction log to be 10%, which is 100. And now obviously we want to change the auto growth also. We don't want it to be 1 megabyte. So for the database, you click on the ellipse. Make sure you've selected the in megabytes. And we determined that we want the auto growth increments to grow in 100 megabytes at a time and unlimited data. And we go OK. Same thing with the transaction log auto growth. Click on the ellipse. Go megabytes. And let's say we want that to be increased by 10% of that, which is 10 megabytes. And go OK and unlimited. And now if I were to go OK, the database will be created with these predefined sizes and predefined auto growth patterns here. And that's what we ideally want. The other thing obviously to note is that obviously I'm using a different SQL environment on my local computer rather than using a domain, and I'll point that out later. But obviously these paths must be separated for the data files and the transactional log files. And we've discussed that previously in what a domain is and how to install the SQL server. But for our purpose right now, this is fine. But again, this should be on a separate drive. So now if I go OK, it's going to create the database, and it just may take about 30 or 40 seconds, depending on the size of this. Now obviously the obvious question becomes, how do you initially size the databases, and how do you initially size the auto growth patterns here? And let me address that in a second. I'll refresh it. And there's our database production. Obviously, if you wanted to just see it again, you can go right-click, Properties, Files, and there we are. So the question becomes, how do we initially size the data files and the transactional log files and the auto growth files? How do we determine that? Well, that is obviously determined by your environment. It all depends on the workload your environment is doing. And obviously that requires a pre-analysis for that called capacity planning. And that is outside the scope of this particular class here. I may have another dedicated to that. But primarily you want to obviously determine how much growth you're doing in a weekly basis or a monthly basis or a yearly basis, and determine that. And there are several methods of doing that. Again, this beyond the scope of this tutorial. But that's how you basically do it. So let's say you've determined that in a year or in a monthly basis, you're increasing 10 gigs per month. And then obviously if that's 120 gigs a year approximately, then you can initially size this and base it upon a 2 or 3 year basis. So if your initial size, you've determined that the activity growth in a year is about 100 gigs, then I would make this initial size 300 gigs. And same thing in taking into consideration for the transactional log. That is determined also by activity of how much modification you're doing to the initial database itself. And that obviously is determined by analysis also. And so you would allocate sufficient space here and allocate sufficient space on the physical hard drive. So this is how you would determine it. So let's say for our purposes that this is sufficient for the next year and nothing will grow beyond this on the physical drive. So this is fine. Now remember, the physical drive is going to be larger than these initial sizes of the data files and the log files. These files, these sizes are based for the transactional log file and the data file, not the physical drive. The physical drive will be larger than this. And so if I go to OK, that's fine. So that's one way of creating a database. So let me now repeat that and create it through a scripting it out. So let me delete this database, close existing, and go OK. And let's refresh. So now if you want to create a database using a T-SQL, obviously, as you can see, there's a tremendous amount to write here. You've got use master go, then you have to use the syntax create database followed by the database name, set it on primary, you have to give it a name, you have to give the file name, the size you want to have the initial size of the database file, the file growth increment you want to allocate, and then you have to repeat the same thing for the log file. And as you can see, this is a tremendous amount to write. Well, I don't write them. The easy way to do it is to what's called script it out. And scripting out means the following. Go to your database, right click, go new database, and then initial here, just set up your production. And let's just make it, let's say 1000 or 1000. Let's make this 100. Let's change this also, megabytes to, let's say 100. Okay, let's change this to 10, and that's okay. So now, if I were to go OK, it'll produce that database. What I want to do is script it out. So if you go over here where it says script, click on this down button here and go script action in a new query. And as soon as you do that, it's scripted out. Close this. There is the actual script that will create that database. And all you have to do is go execute and it will produce that database. Obviously, all these alter statements are done in the background also. You don't need to worry about that. What I'm primarily concerned with is now allocating the sizes here. So if I wanted to change the size or the file growth of the data file, I can do that here. If I wanted to change the file size or the file growth and allocate it differently here, I can do it here. So basically, we'll go back to here. And now all I've done is just eliminate all this and then just commented out these, and I get this. So here is, as you can see, the create database production, and all I would have to do is set the parameters I want for size, for file growth, for the log, and same thing for the size and the file growth for the primary database file. And all I would do is highlight this, execute, and it'll create a database for me also. And now I can save this file as a create database file. And if I want to create another database, all I have to do is change the production, the name of the database, and change the configurations that I want, rather than going right-click on that. But it's an easier way of doing that and managing databases than doing the GUI version. At least I think so. So you have either choice of doing it, whichever way you feel comfortable. You may do that. So that once this is created, I'm going to create another database, just to point out how easy it is to change it and where to change the database. Anywhere basically you see the word production, I'm going to change it to production 2, and then just execute the same script, and it'll be a lot faster. Obviously, I'm going to change the configurations. One thing you'll notice here that you'll notice that the size is in kilobytes, and the file growth also by default is in kilobytes. You can change that to megabytes, and I have that because it's just easier to round off and understanding 1,000 than understanding 1,024 or kilobytes. Here you can see it's 1,224,000 whatever kilobytes here. So again, it can get confusing here. So it's easier just to round it off by kilobytes, by megabytes, and I've done that. And now if I go here, refresh, you can see I've got the production database. So now I'm going to change that. I'm going to create another database called production 2. So all I'm going to do is go to here, wherever I see the word production, I'm going to change it. Obviously, you want to change the MDF file here to 2. We want to change it here for the log. And again, all I'm doing is just changing this. I want to change the size to a little so it doesn't take that much. So I'm going to make it 5 megabytes here. I'm going to make it 1 megabyte there. Make it 1 megabyte there. And then 1 megabyte here. So we don't have to wait too long. And now if I highlight and execute, you'll see that the database here has been created very quickly. So that's the great advantage of using scripts. So you can script out the database. A couple of things, obviously, still using the Sprock SB help database, followed by the by the database name, gives you the information which we've gone over many times. So now let's look at some of the notes and understand what we just did. So size the physical drive size both on the data and the transactional log based on the activity and workload. So again, that addresses that question: how big should my initial database size be, and how large should my data files physical drives be? And that's determined by activity and workload. As both data file and log files are on separate hard drive, if possible, allocate the data file and log file to the amount of physical drive. And what I mean by that is, for example, if you have a 1 terabyte of a physical hard drive and you want to allocate, let's say, 500 gigabytes of data drive to that, that's fine, long as that's the activity that's occurring. And same thing with the transactional log file. If you have a physical hard drive that's 100 gigs and nothing else is going to be on it, then it's safe to make that drive at least about 30% of it allocated to the transactional log file. We have also set auto growth to increase by 50 megabytes for the transactional log. But what if the transactional log needs more than 50 megabytes of suite? Won't that cause the auto growth to kick in? Isn't that what we're saying we want to prevent? Well, it certainly will kick in, and that's fine. The question is a frequency. And the one way to obviously control that is the auto growth from kicking in if the activity suddenly occurs beyond the allocated 50 megabytes for the transactional log, is to constantly take backups. And if another transaction needs more than 50 megs of space, let me correct that, won't the transactional log get full and stop working? And the answer is yes. If you go beyond the physical capacity of the drive that you've allocated the transactional log to, then the SQL server will stop because it's consumed all the physical drive where the transactional log file is. But that's why we've been stressing that you must take transactional log backups to truncate the logs so the log file never reaches the maximum of the physical drive. And that's the reason why we've been saying this all along for the last almost 10 videos. And again, this is the importance of understanding it. That's why I've dedicated so many videos to this concept, because this is the crux of SQL administration. And as you learn this, and as you practice this, and as you do this in the work environment, you'll realize the necessity for all this. So I'm going to leave it there and continue with the next one. And my name is Raphael, and this is how to become a production SQL database administrator.